importantly, she's well renowned for her work in reproductive health and feminist theory in psychology, specifically on issues related to teenage pregnancy, abortion, sex education, feminist psychology, and post-colonialism. Now, Catriona was also awarded the Distinguished Publications Award by the Association for Women in Psychology, based in America, for her book Adolescence, Pregnancy and Abortion, Constructing a Thread for Degeneration. And then also, Lee, we also would like to thank Puleng Segalo, our very own, who will be conducting today's interview. And Puleng's work parallels closely with that of Catriona's, in that her work focuses mainly on the interplay between gender power and sexuality. Now, the people behind the paper's project aims to uncover what it is like to be practicing research in psychology and also in other related fields, and this is achieved through interviewing prominent academics such as Catriona. Now, today we hope to uncover some of the personal aspects hidden behind Catriona's work and publications, and to see how she relates to work on a personal level by discussing some of her published works that had a significant impact on her personally as well as her career. Now, without further ado, let's hand over to Puleng. Enjoy.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we can just jump right into it. And I thought maybe we could start about your journey. Where did it all begin for you? So basically, who is Catriona?
Oh. I'm not going to start with I was born on. But the journey in terms of the academic project began, I guess, in what sort of influenced the work that I do at the moment, began when my first job after I did my master's in educational psychology was at the Wits Rural Facility, which is a facility out near Acorn Hook. And for those of you who don't know, it's that area, two former homeland areas, the former Gazankulu and the former Leboa, kind of sit right next to each other, right next to the Kruger Park. And I worked in that area for the Health Systems Development Unit and for the education program. And the work it was a very interesting setup, because it was a kind of a combination of research work and community engagement. So it was doing that kind of fairly difficult cusp type of work where you're trying to do research but you're also trying to do interventions at the same time. And I think that is a tension that a lot of work that psychologists do. You know, we experience that kind of tension, and how do we manage it? And I think it's a healthy tension, but it's always, because often inevitably you either go into the intervention and do that, or you kind of do the research. But anyway, the work that I did there, the two things that I was engaged with was a community mental health program and an education program. And neither of those programs were directly involved with anything around sexualities or reproduction, anything that I'm currently working on. One was literally to work with inclusive education, and the other one was to work with outpatient psychiatric outpatients who were going into the community, back into some very under-resourced rural areas, and what happens when they've been discharged. So those were the two programs. But what struck me in working with health service providers and educators in that situation was how many times they would go, oh, teenage pregnancy, click their tongues, terrible, It just came up really often. And so that's when my interest in teenage pregnancy was sparked, and listening to the kind of narratives around how it's sort of framed as a it's a real social problem, but also a personal tragedy. And so it was from there that I thought, okay, well, let's inspect this notion of teenage pregnancy. pregnancy. Let's take a step back. And then soon after that, I moved to the University of Zululand, mainly because the funding, it was a contract post, so the funding for the facility, it wasn't refunded, and so I was essentially jobless, so I got a post at the University of Zululand, where I then started my PhD on teenage pregnancy. And the kind of the stance within that PhD is really very much a kind of a critical psychology, the kind of questioning and deconstruction of the notion of teenage pregnancy, and how it was about the technologies of representation in the scientific literature in South Africa, about how teenage pregnancy is represented in scientific literature. Anyway, so that was the kind of start, and really since then it's been kind of, I've literally been just carrying on in the same kind of area. We've expanded to looking at termination of pregnancy, to looking at sexualities more broadly, to looking at sexuality education, looking at things like intimate partner violence in pregnancy, reproductive decision making, antenatal and postnatal care. So there's now quite a, we have a research program which is called Critical Studies in Sexualities and Reproduction, a grand name. And underneath that program there are a number of different projects and quite a big team of people that are working, and some international and national collaborators. But what's interesting is that now, just before coming here, I went back. I was literally drove from the Wits Rural facility to come here. So I've just gone back to where it all started.
Wow.
You know, starting those conversations about re-engaging with that area, and possibly doing something.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, and I wonder how that's been like for you. Like, going back, like traveling back to where it all began.
Yes.
So thinking back on how things were then, and looking at where we are now in terms of the work that you're doing, what do you see, as you think back in terms of maybe the progress or lack thereof
in South Africa?
Reflecting, reflecting on the work that you're doing.
Yes. Well, I think that sexualities and reproduction is an incredibly fascinating area to work in, because what it is absolutely clear to me are the complexities. That, if you take, for example, the termination of pregnancy as an example, we have very enabling legislation. In terms of the kinds of things that are legislated, the rights that are enabled through the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act. And so that's, but that's only one part of the picture. It's incredibly complex, and the access to abortion and the kinds of ways in which people who access abortion are spoken about, and the kind of stigma that attaches to it, makes it, that our understandings that access is not simply about what's in policy or what's legislated, that it's a complex kind of set of cultural and personal narratives that surround this. So, I think in many respects in terms of sexuality and reproduction there's been obviously huge strides, but a lot of, we make kind of progress, I suppose, whatever one wants to call progress, I don't know. In one area, but in others there's still huge problems, difficulties, complexities.
Yeah, I think in one of the chapters that you've recently written, you speak about that also, that now there's legislation around abortion, and we're talking about the notion of choice, which you also problematize, and in talking about now that people have the freedom to choose to have an abortion, but there's now another dilemma, which is where you use your critical lens in terms of now the pathologizing or the psychology of it, or this assumption that if you have an abortion, then you're going to be psychologically affected by it. So that's the one lens. And then on the other hand is the medical intervention also, where the medical experts also come in terms of actually performing the abortion. So you, as the subject, as the person having the abortion, you have all these issues around you, and that voice is usually not heard. And how you problematize that in talking about the challenges within psychology, in how we're quick to pathologize. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because in your work you use the gender lens, which is something that is usually ignored within psychology, in how we look at work. And I was just interested in terms of how that fits into your work. How do you use psychology to make sense of the work that you do with the many challenges that we see within psychology?
Are you asking?
Am
I still a psychologist?
Maybe that is the question. Maybe that is the question. How is psychology assisting you to make sense?
Yes. You know, I think that one of the things about psychology, well, there's two things. It's both a strength and a weakness. Psychology manages to be all things to all people. It's like a root that manages to get into all facets of everybody's life. The psychologization of life, the psych complex that Nicholas Rose talks about. That, you know, we virtually, well, not everywhere, so one must be careful of making these kinds of claims, but certainly in more resource situations, a lot of how we understand the world is read through the lens of psychological discourse, psychologization. So that's it. So that's and then of course, you know, in terms of the kind of post-structural analysis of psychology is that we participate in perpetuating particular power relations through individualizing social problems. And so it becomes quite a powerful tool in which to regulate individuals, in which to regulate particular relationships and particular ways of being, you know, heteronormativity, etc. So in one sense, that's I suppose depending on from which standpoint you're talking about, whether that's a strength or a weakness, but that's certainly something we must recognize about psychology. And the job of critical psychologists is to recognize it and to point it out, to name it, and to understand how that's happening, which is part of what, you know, in that one paper that I was trying to do in terms of discussing the post-abortion syndrome and how it's being used in many ways, only one of which is the sort of anti-abortion kind of campaigns. But the strength of psychology is its permeability. So in some senses that it does create spaces for, I think, for psychologists to claim and name themselves as critical psychologists. Again, whatever that means, because it's not clear. Okay. But you so I suppose one of the things that I have seen in my work is to stretch the boundaries of psychology beyond the idea that psychology is about the individual, and to say, well, no, I think that psychology, we need to stretch it into saying that we're not losing sight of the individual, but that our lens needs to stretch to the social. And how, you know, there again, you know, is it gender or is it, or what are you using as the social? How are you understanding the social? So I suppose one of the things that I would say I am is an anti-psychology psychologist.
Okay.
And with the paradox that, you know, is irresolvable but important, I think.
Sure. We've just continuing with that, we just had the ICP, the conference last year, and I'm aware that you wrote a paper just looking at psychology within South Africa and where we are and what is it that psychology is doing. And one of the things I think that came out in the paper was how much, traditional understanding or traditional way of doing psychology, where we're looking at assessment, we're looking at psychopathology, it's still very much in the mainstream. And how some socio-economic inequalities or social justice issues is still something that is missing in our writing, in our theorizing, in our teaching. And I'm just wondering in terms of, as a critical psychologist, because oftentimes those are the things that you look at, and whether the two can really be married. Oftentimes you find in a corridor, like this corridor, there's always, there's that one critical psychologist. And that conversation is just not taking place in what would be called mainstream psychology and critical psychology. And I found that very interesting. And I was just wondering, do you see that as something that is happening within all the different institutions or psychology broadly within South Africa, or do you see a space really for the rethinking and using a critical lens when we look at psychology in South Africa? So I guess, is there really a space?
I think there's more of a space here than exists in many other circumstances where psychology is well established. You see, and I think that's the point about South Africa, is that psychology, if we look on the African continent, psychology is the most established here in South Africa. And there's good reasons for that in terms of our colonial history and apartheid history, etc. And of course, a lot of think of what's happening in psychology is a question mark over psychology as a colonial project as well. And there's a lot of work in terms of indigenous psychologies, African psychologies, and what does that mean? So when I say we have a better chance of that in South Africa as compared to other contexts where psychology is well established, if you're looking at the UK and the States, etc., those sorts of spaces where a lot of the knowledge production around psychology occurs, given the kind of imbalances in terms of resources to publish and publishing houses, etc. If you look at those contexts, the shutting down of what psychology is very, I think it's quite stringent. I think there's quite a lot of, through things like their research assessment exercise in the UK, similar sort of mechanisms in the United States, where people who are critical psychologists no longer actually work in psychology departments. They work in sociology or, linguistics even, so some other space, because it's starting to be predefined what psychology is. So, very much the kind of quantitative, experimental, working on the traditional topics, those sorts of things. Now, I'm not saying that one shouldn't do that kind of work. I think it's important, and that's precisely the dialogue that needs to happen. But our spaces in South Africa, we actually don't realize how privileged we are, because you can have someone like me in a department. I mean, it's a bit outrageous, actually. I get to teach what I want to teach. If I'm given a developmental psychology course, I subvert all the stuff, and I get to research. I get to my publications get recognized by colleagues, other colleagues in psychology. They don't say, well, that's not psychology. It gets counted for whatever. So, and we have dialogues. We have a lot of very interesting and innovative stuff coming out of South Africa. I mean, we're a small community, so I think that the kind of impact is limited only by the fact that we're a small community in terms of the kind of global network of psychologists. I mean, if you think of how many psychologists there are, for example, in the States, it's just enormous. But relative to our size, I think the kinds of things that are coming out of the kind of critical spaces in psychology are having quite a big impact. And really, in terms of the critical community globally, South Africa is recognized as a space where innovative work is happening. And so in that sense, I think that it's very positive what's happening here. That doesn't mean to say that we've got it entirely right. I think that indeed we do tend to still follow the formula. We haven't done enough to say, actually, how can we just, decide on a completely different curriculum? How can we do it completely differently and just not worry about what's happening? Let's decide for ourselves. And there are dangers to that because we might make a complete hash of it, of course. So you've got to be careful. I mean, I think I'm all for very careful kind of methodical thinking through any kind of changes, because there's often things you don't see down the line you didn't see when you were doing it. So I'm not saying that everything is hunky-dory, and I think that paper, as you say, what it was an analysis of the South African Journal of Psychology and abstracts in the PsycInfo that had South Africa attached to it. And it does show, certainly in terms of knowledge production, it's not an indication of anything other than knowledge production. It's not an indication of what's happening in the classroom or how people are practicing or anything like that. But it's certainly in terms of knowledge production, we haven't done, there's kind of some work, but it certainly is we're still quite bogged down in a particular way of doing psychology that doesn't reflect where we live, to be frank. So, and part of the things, I mean, one of the questions that was raised at that particular paper was somebody was saying, he'd really like to do this kind of more work in Cape Town, and he'd like to do more work in Khayelitsha, but he's got to earn money. How do we earn money? Well, we charge clients medical aid. And my response to that is that we suffer from a lack of imagination. That we imagine the only way we can earn money is either by working for the state or by working in private practice. We either work as a psychologist in a hospital or we work in private practice. And in fact, I think there's an enormous amount of scope for psychologists to insert themselves more in the kinds of organizations that do social type work. So, and I think there's just too little of that, and maybe we don't prepare our students enough for those possibilities. Just too few in those kinds of situations.
The writing or teaching what you like. I mean, for me, that article, as you say, it reflects the knowledge production. What is being published, what's out there, and you're saying what happens in the classroom is something else, or could be something else,
yes.
Which for me is a bit of a tragedy, really, because if what's being produced or what we publish is not really at par with what we teach in class, then there's no correlation or relationship between the two, and that's a bit of a challenge, which is something that I think that you managed to master in terms of doing what you like. Publishing about it and teaching about it, and your appointment as the chair for SACHI. Congratulations on that. Critical Studies in Sexualities and Reproduction, Human and Social Dynamics. What a mouthful!
Say it quickly.
Yes. So I just want you to tell us more about what that entails, and also. Being the chair, what is it that you get to do, and the kind of projects that you're busy with?
Well, it's going to be. It's just starting. So this chair will start at the beginning of next year, and I'm already quaking in the knees. What's interesting about this. Is that now, when you work in a department, you do your teaching, you do your admin, and try to do as little of that as you possibly can, when admin tasks are being steering your lap. And then the research is sort of, and it shouldn't be like that, but it is, let's be honest. the research is kind of like the bonus, the fun stuff that you do when you've done everything else. And if you publish one paper or 20, as long as you're doing something, they'll pat you on the back. And, you know, so now the fun stuff is my job. And you know, this is and suddenly it's not such fun anymore, in a strange way, because this is now what I'm going to be judged on. So it comes with that kind of stress, in the sense of you're thinking, oh, what are the funders going to do? Are they going to like this? Am I doing enough? You know, are they going to? Are there enough students? Am I doing? Because the other thing, of course, is dissemination. So it's got to be beyond journals. It's got to be in policy briefs. It's got to be in journal articles. Now, I don't know how to write those things. I haven't a clue. So I'm going to have to get help with that. We're very good, and that's the one thing that I noticed. Well, certainly about myself. I speak about myself, not all academics, but we're very good at writing in a particular genre. But as soon as we start writing in other genres, try and kind of communicate our work in other ways, in more accessible ways, or different ways, shall we say. For me, at any rate, the wheels fall off. Useless at that, useless. So, you know, I'm going to have to develop that. It's going to be a challenge, an interesting one. So the way that this chair is set up is that there, as I said, there's these sort of multiple projects, and we have collaboration with people at the University of York and the University, and in the Netherlands as well, University of Utrecht. So, you know, there's a kind of a range of people and also at UWC and Stellenbosch. So that's quite nice. It opens up the possibility of creating kind of spaces for dialogue, creating collaboration. So I'm seeing my task within this chair as being a facilitator of kind of multiple things happening, and kind of multiple voices and dialogues and threads and research, and you know, things coming together and going apart. And so it becomes, in a sense, less about my research, but more about creating a network. And part of creating that network is to, what I have to do is to ignore the way in which it's set up. And this is my critique, in a sense, of the NRF and the way that the funding works, the National Research Foundation, because the funding works into, you know, for the rating, for example, an individual gets rated. Whoever does research as whoever does it as an individual, nobody, you know, and yet we rate an individual. It's problematic for both, I think, scholarship and for the person, because it just builds into ego politics, which can be really, really horrible at university. I mean, ego politics that you know, it can be very destructive. So that's the one thing. And then the Saatchi chair is also said, I mean, it's given to an individual, which is also problematic, I think. It should be for a research program that has a principal leader. So my kind of, the way that I am working with it is to try to ignore that, to say that's just the game, in a sense, you play to get the money, but that's not how we operate. How we operate is as a team, as a group of people, as a network of people who are going to be working on things that we're passionate about. And that's the important thing, is that there's a shared passion, a shared kind of sense of energy, a shared you know, feeling that this is really important and worthwhile work, and we're interested, and we are also curious about things, and we don't know all the answers, but we want to find out more, you know, and we want to write about the stuff, and we want to debate it, and, you know, have that kind of energy that is that kind of energy is only communal. It's never individual. Well, it can be individual own moments, but you know, it's communal. So that's my kind of task that I'm setting myself is to facilitate that kind of energy, that kind of communal space, that is what the chair enables, is somebody to do that kind of labour. And I mean, when you do that, you get the most amazing stuff, you know, coming out. It does mean a lot more. I mean, I sort of feel a bit like I've gone from being head of department, where I did a lot of organising and managing, and thinking, phew, I got rid of that, yay, God, I'm so clever, and now I've got more admin and more management, just of a different nature.
Yeah.
So, yeah, well, 5 years, you know, it's for 5 years, and we'll see how it goes, yeah.
Okay. I just want to revisit what you said at the beginning when you're talking about where it started, and just this disconnect between the research that we do, the work that we do, and then the community engagement or the community projects that we do. Because oftentimes then you do research and you write on a project that you did out there. And in one of your papers with Sunil Bhatia, you speak about speaking for, and how that could be a problem. You know, we might mean well because we represent the people, but then whose voice, you know, goes out there, and how that can, in its sense, be a recolonizing project. You know, and I was just wondering, in terms of your own work, and maybe if you could talk about one of your research projects and how you approach the work and how you work together with the participants, if you will. How do you go about doing your own research work?
I think the notion of outsider-insider relations and the fractiousness thereof, because we're always outsiders and insiders simultaneously. It doesn't matter who we relate to. We are simultaneously an outsider and insider. You're never entirely an insider, you're never entirely an outsider, but you may be kind of on different levels outside and inside. Look, my own work has I've mostly avoided speaking for anybody, but rather represented power relations. So that's been the kind of way in which I suppose I've sidestepped that dilemma of I go and interview, you know, whatever, a pregnant teenager, and I say, oh, well, that's what she's saying, now let me write this up, and, you know, now this is the reality of teenage pregnancy, you know, according to this person or these group of participants, you know, and that's how it is, kind of thing. So I sidestepped that somewhat, and it, you know, one could critique that, I suppose, but I've sidestepped it by concentrating on power relations. So looking at, you know, as you say, the sort of technologies of representation, the technologies of intervention, and always seeing what I'm doing is analyzing the social dynamics that are at play in a particular situation. So it's never been, for me at least, my work has not been about representing those people for. It's just a neat little trick, I don't know, but I also just think that that's the nature of the kinds of research questions that I ask. That doesn't try to find the essence of a person or a group of people, so representing them in particular ways. I suppose in talking about power relations, you're inevitably representing people in particular ways, but so maybe one doesn't entirely avoid it. But the notion of power relations is one, certainly the way in which I use it is that it is fluid and complex, so power relation in particular, you know, changes and shifting. You know, and it's a relation precisely, so if you do different things, or you know, act in different ways or take on different ways of being, then the power relation also shifts. It's not static. I don't know if that's answered your question. I've simply avoided it.
No, I hear. Because sometimes there are always complexities when you go out there.
Yes.
And then when you come back, who gets to write, who gets to represent, you know, and then whose voices becomes heard, you know, who gets to write and represent how people's experiences are and what people's experiences are.
Yes.
So it's always a dilemma. So I understand you're looking at it that way, and some of the challenges around that also.
Yes.
And just on the notion of power relations, one of the things that you mentioned, what I picked up in the papers that I read, is the notion of the rational economic man and the rational economic woman. You know, now that women can work, but then they still have to come back and look after the children and cook and that. But then they're working, they're in the workplace, so you know, they're economic women. In looking at the expectations and challenges, and one saying, you know, it's the rational man and the rational woman, but what's the balance between the two? And you know, how that plays out in terms of you making meaning of power relations. Because one of the things that I feel is being avoided with psychology is gender, or the gender psychology of the role, or using a gender lens when we try and understand these challenges that happen in people's lives. That, you know, more women are now entering the workplace and what that means for them. So the power play around that, and saying the woman is irrational because now she can handle 1, 2, and 3, and is that really an irrationality or not? Yeah. So in your own thinking, in your own theorizing, the parallels between the two, do you see any, or those challenges are still there?
Parallels between
you know, the rational woman and the rational man.
You see, I mean, I think that where that work came off was, it's I think I sent one of the papers to Konzi, was about looking at, you know, how do we approach the feminist approach to teenage pregnancy. So one of the arms of that is the sort of deconstructive process of looking at taken for granted assumptions that underpin the kinds of pronouncements that we make. And that the whole thing of the rational economic man, Homo economicus in Foucault's terms. The creation of the, and I mean, it has to do, of course, with economic power relations and the creation of the split between the public and the private. So Homo economicus, who is masculinized, engages in the public world. And it has to do, I mean, also, you know, the kind of rise in a sense of the, you know, Industrial Revolution, which separated out manufacturing from the home, in the home, within the home, into your factories. So your economic activity happens away from the home, whereas previously it would happen kind of centered around the home. And so now you have that, with that, the movement of the economic activity away from home into sort of those public spaces, into the factories, into the space away from home. You have the creation of the public and private split, with the woman occupying the private and the man occupying the public. And then a number of kind of gendered assumptions going along with that, the kind of creation of rationality, which men, and nurturing and caring being associated with women. You know, the reinforcement of a fairly strict divide, gendered divide. But that, you know, in a sense has been overcome with the kind of, I suppose, the early feminist movement, the kind of more liberal feminism that wanted equal pay for work and access to work and rights to work and maternity leave, and, you know, lots of useful battles around that. To the extent now that there is an economic imperative around women engaging in, there's the expectation of women engaging in that economic realm, but it's limited. So you are expected to desire to become Homo economicus to a point, but not to the point that it jeopardizes your reproductive capacities. So once you choose to engage, and this is, we're doing, one of the projects that we're doing is on child freeness. So women who choose to become Homo economicus and to forego their reproductive capacities, to forego childbearing, actually a huge amount of stigma attaches to them. You know, they're seen as selfish, they're seen as the person that I'm working with on this, she says, you're sad, you're psychologically damaged, mad, you know, selfish, and, or bad. So there's a, yeah, so the Homo economicus is an interesting one because there's that fluidity. There isn't the kind of, you know, strict, that's the man and that's the, you know, public male, masculinized, private, feminized. And yet, with that process, there's been a, it's become quite contradictory and paradoxical and in a sense a double bind for women. So, and it's what underpins a lot of the pathologization of teenage pregnancy, because if a young woman gets pregnant, one of the things that they say is that it jeopardizes her chances of sort of socioeconomic advancement. So that's the big thing. You're going to be poor, you just, you know, perpetuating the underclass, you know. So the assumption there is that young women should desire to go into, to be economically valuable to society. The other kind of contradiction there is that, of course, the rational economic man is never equivalent to the rational economic woman, because the rational economic man, the expectations around care are never the same for men, or at least on an average, than for women. So the care of it's not only care of children, it's care of people who are ill, you know, family members who are ill, it's you know, care of disabled people, all of that care labor. I mean, the stats show it pretty much done mostly by women. You know. So the expectations, the rational economic man as such is highly gendered in the sense that you are a person who engages in production and not care and not reproduction. So when the woman enters that, so that's the definition in a sense of the rational economic man, is that he engages in production pretty much, and breadwinning, earning money. Whereas the rational economic woman does not have to engage, has to still engage in, you know, care, reproduction. So she's not equivalent to the rational economic man. They're not the same thing. Yeah. And that underpins that kind of, you know, if we start looking at some of the statements, you kind of then, you know, unpack. That's the, you know, unpacking the technical. Right. See those gendered relationships and the implications of it. Slightly longer explanation than you may be.
No. That's great, because yeah, it offers an understanding in terms of, you know, the challenges between the two. And just again, revisiting this whole notion of gender or feminist perspectives used within psychology, and how sometimes if you're saying you're using a feminist perspective, it's sometimes frowned upon, and where's the psychology in that? I say this because I have a student who wanted to go to another university, and her topic was not accepted because it was not psychology enough. You know, in looking at, you know, using a feminist perspective, looking at women again here, looking at the rational economic man and women, looking at women who are now breadwinners and saying, you know, this is what I'm going to look at. So again, because she's not looking at, you know, how are they suffering, what are the challenges, but looking at their own meaning making and experiences, that they give, and how they have to navigate and maneuver between home and the workplace now that they're breadwinners. And just how there's still that, again, I speak of psychology within South Africa, there's still that set definition of what psychology is, and if you don't fit within those set frameworks, it becomes a bit of a challenge. And I was wondering, in terms of your work, have you come across those challenges where sometimes you might want to maybe publish a paper and then in a psychology journal, and you're told it's not psychology enough, or rejected on those grounds? Yeah.
Well, the other sort of rather largish project that I'm taking on, so wish me well in the next 5 years, is I've taken over as editor-in-chief of the journal Feminism and Psychology.
Okay.
So that is precisely the dilemma that journal is trying to grapple with. That interface between feminisms and psychology and what that means. And feminisms, you see, what we've done is we've now, so look out for our editorial, which will come out in the first issue of Feminism and Psychology in the next year, where we pluralize feminism to feminisms and psychology to psychologies. So, and it's exactly, that's what that journal is exactly about, is grappling with the challenges of being a psychologist, but being a feminist psychologist, and what are the implications of sort of theorizing in feminisms for psychologies, and vice versa. What does psychology say to us about feminisms? And I don't think it's an easy marriage, or at least kind of conversation, perhaps. And I suppose the advice to students is choose your supervisor, because it is indeed going to happen that some departments are going to not see what we do. I mean, and I suppose it's a valid question: is this psychology? Is it really psychology? And then you have to argue the case.
Yeah, and I think you've done an amazing job in really opening up that space. And I'm excited to hear about feminism and psychology.
Yes, so please send in articles, please.
No, we will. We've actually, I actually did already send one with Pete, and that's how I know about the limitations in terms of feminist psychologies within South Africa. Because with you and Cheryl Delare and Cheryl Potgieter, there hasn't really been much to draw from in terms of looking at what's been done with the two within psychology, which is a tragedy, really. And hence, that's why I feel that your work is so important, and that I hope you remain rooted within psychology, because I think that is needed, within the discipline itself, and how that can feed into what we also give to our students, and legitimizing the work that they're doing and the importance of it as well. Looking at South Africa and the challenges, and domestic violence against women, and how psychology can come into that, and how feminist perspectives can also speak into that, where we really problematize and really pull that apart. So yes, I'm excited, and hopefully there'll be more papers. I'm sure some of my colleagues who are here
please do.
will take that on as well.
One of the things that we're wanting to do with that journal, and you'll see in that editorial, what we do is we analyze in that particular journal, because it's meant as an international journal, but what we analyze is what are the topics that are coming in to the journal. So we took sort of 12 years and looked, okay, what are the topics in which, who is publishing in the journal, and what is clear is a dominance of the global north, if one wants to kind of create that. So one of the things that I'm very keen on, and which I am you know, pleased about in terms of having the opportunity is to try to get voices. Global north and global south, slightly problematic, but if we're going to use these large terms, you know, from other areas in the world, I'm very keen for it to form, because I think once you start engaging, because psychology is so pinned down in the global world, I think it's to shift it. You have to have voices, in a sense, from the periphery. That are inserted, that are challenging, you know, and it's when it's those sorts of voices that bring in questions and perspectives that people haven't really thought about. Oh, well, you know, that's a good idea. You know, that it becomes more dynamic, and that the discipline as a whole becomes more dynamic. So I'm very keen to support that.
Yes. Okay, I wanted to ask something around the questions in research, how the question sometimes determines the kind of answer that one gets. And this was something that I picked up in one of the papers that you sent to Kwanzi, and how one needs to be very careful about that, because drawing from Foucault, you're saying that a Foucauldian feminist would not ask, what is the true nature of the pregnant teenager? You know, when you want to understand about teenage pregnancy, but instead phrase it and ask, how have scientific and professional discourses constructed or positioned her as a subject? You know, and I found that very useful and profound in looking at what does the policy say. You have the legal right. You know, there's teenage pregnancy, and teenagers are still allowed to go to school, and then they get time off, and then they can come back to school, and how some people find that has been problematic, and then, but it's, you know, it's legal that they can do that, and also with abortion as well, that it's legalized. And in us trying to understand that, the importance of the question that you ask, and how you ask the questions, and where that places that teenager, right, and her own, you know, subject positioning, and how does she feel about what's being said about her. So I just thought it's just very useful to just bring that out in terms of the importance of the question that you ask, you know, and the kind of response that one gets in return.
My students hate me, because I always, they come and they talk and they say, so what's your research question again? You know, you're talking about all of this, but let's ground it. What is your research question? How does this relate to your research question? You know, write it on your forehead or something like that, you know. But yeah, I think that in spending a lot of time thinking, what are the implications of this research question? And working with it and thinking through it very carefully. I think that it's very easy to say, I want to do, this is my topic and I'm going to do it. But now, what does that mean? What does it mean? How are you actually grounding this in a particular kind of framework? And what does this mean in terms of what you can say? I mean, it's the standard kind of research stuff. But I'm very aware of how my students sort of have their research question and just sort of disappears, you know. And it really is absolutely essential. And asking, and I think that's where the new innovative work comes through, is to say, how can we ask different questions?
Yes.
And what does that mean?
Something to think about. So, yeah, as we wrap up, Katrina, I just want to know the journey ahead, where to from here. You're now the Saatchi Chair and the new editor for Feminism and Psychology, and it really sounds like you have your work cut out for you in those two journeys moving ahead. But is there anything else maybe that's in the pipeline, or that you're busy with at the moment that maybe you want to share with us?
That's it.
Is that more than enough?
More than enough. Yeah. But I'd like to share with you, and maybe this is something to do with, you know, it's about South African psychology, feminism and psychology. The very first editorial that was written about feminism and psychology, they were very clear that the journal would not be available in South Africa, and they would not publish articles from South Africa. This was 1991. Very clear, written very explicitly in the first editorial of Feminism and Psychology. So I think that we, as a kind of community of psychologists can say, well, I think that psychology has come some distance in South Africa that, now really attention for South Africa. I'm pleased about that. Yes, I mean, it's not about me, it's about how, it's a recognition, I suppose, of the kinds of work that's being done in South Africa and the kind of, the voices that are in South Africa, and a recognition that this could be a good space. I'm not the only editor, so I'm the editor-in-chief. There's one in the UK and one, Rose Capdevila in the UK, and Jean Morissette in the United States. So it's quite a kind of global team. But I think that's it's an indication, I think. So when they decided on approaching me, I think it's an indication of how feminist and critical psychology is being seen in South Africa. In fact, the previous editor was saying there's really some very wonderful work coming out of South Africa. It's a good space to have somebody from South Africa as so. That's the kind of despite all of the kind of things that you're talking about, things there's difficulties around being, psychology questions. I think that there is a lot of really positive stuff, and I think we must build on that energy, and we must build on our dialogues and build on keeping each other on our toes.
Yeah, it's very important. Yeah. No, I think that's a beautiful way, actually, of coming to the end of our conversation, and it's really been a delight. Thank you so much. We've been wanting to hear your story and learn from your journey and where you come from and where you are now, in thinking about our own work as well. And so thank you very much. I don't know if we have time maybe for just one or two questions or comments from anybody. Maybe there's a burning issue that you would like to ask Catriona about. Yes, Fred.
Catriona, thank you for inviting us with your insights. I was wondering, in your thinking about feminism and gender, to what extent do you trace it back to the biological roots, the dance between testosterone and estrogen?
Yeah, you see where you went there. I said keep us on our toes, so now you're doing that. Look, I mean, it's the nature-nurture, isn't it? And I suppose my kind of take on that nature-nurture type of debate is that whatever is nature is always taken up in nurture. There's no such thing as us knowing about the biology or the biology being in its raw form, or so it's always culturally kind of embedded. And it's the Judith Butler's work when she talks about sex and gender, and there was the initial sort of feminist distinction between sex and gender, that sex was the biological and gender was the social, and to then talk about gender as such. And then she started problematizing that notion and saying that sex was gender all along, that and collapsing that type of distinction. And she has the nice sort of metaphor which she calls girling. And basically what it is the example that she uses is as the infant is born, you say, it's a girl, and in that moment you are girling that infant. So yes, there's the anatomical kind of structures, and but from that moment of birth, and nowadays actually before the birth through the fetal imaging. You know, the fetuses are girled or boyed from very early on. And so right from early stages, those kinds of, there's no kind of pure biology because we're already acting on the biology through cultural kind of processes. So,
Yeah, I think, yeah, wonderful. I think evolution went wrong at one point. We should have laid eggs. Out of mind, so.
Wow. I don't have a ready response for that.
Sure, yeah, I know. On that note. Yeah, anything else?
Maybe something just to add for me, the whole concept that you referred to about, you know, the inside out, outside in. I think the one thing that, I mean, it's sort of just an anecdote from my own life. Earlier this year, we went through the preparation for the professional board audit of our master's programs, and we had to, you know, fill in all the forms and with the group, and it was like we had to go back 2-3 years in terms of race and gender, etc. And I made the note, like, being a Japanese old woman like myself, I'm struggling to, because I mean, I'm thinking now of a group of 3 years ago who were male, who were female, who were black, who were Indian, who were colored, you know, the categories we put people in. It brings me to the inside out, outside in myself. There is that Japanese woman in here somewhere, and there is a mother in here somewhere, and there's a male and a female, and an old person and a young person. And yeah, it's sort of with age, and also in terms of looking at life and listening to people, is also to go through all those lenses with him. I'm becoming comfortable with all those within me.
Yes.
By being also it was a boy when he was born, and he's white, and he's this language and all of that. It's still there. It will always be there. But I leave room for the rest within.
Well, I think also, and I mean, those categories can't be discounted, and of course the history in South Africa, I mean, it's inevitable, you know, that those categories are going to be important, they're going to have salience. But sometimes we overemphasize the salience in the sense that I think sometimes, you know, I would have more in common with somebody who has the same ideological lens, you know, another feminist, thank you very much, yeah, we can chat, boy. And yet, somebody else who is a white, middle-class female, who has a very different take on the world, will manage to be polite, you know. So those categories, one cannot discount them because clearly the social kind of formations have cohered around those categories. So one cannot discount them, but I think sometimes we pay them too much attention in how we understand outside and inside of relationships. And the yeah, and when we do that, I mean, you know, it's the whole kind of thing, you know, is race constructed or is it real, and all of those kinds of and how much by reasserting them do we reconstruct them as real, you know, so, you know, the particular categories, and of course that's one of the questions, of course, when people are doing the obligatory reflexivity section in research, qualitative research now, you know, and there's the confession, oh well, forgive me, but I'm middle class, you know. And one mustn't, you know, I'm being a bit facetious now, but, you know, we confess it, and then what does it mean? You know, how do we take it from there? Absolutely. So maybe you need to, you know, trouble it. It's about troubling. It's about understanding, but also troubling, which is exactly what you're doing with the Japanese woman, and you know this and that. You're troubling it and saying, you know, recognize, but also trouble it. You know? And I had this conversation with Kevin, my dear supervisor, Kevin Durheim, who supervised my PhD, and he's written that book, Race Trouble. And so I was asking him about, you know, writing about race as a white male, and he said, well, he's going to write in the preface, being black like me, you know, so, you know, why can't he say, you know, so it's about troubling. No, you know, there could be debates about whether that's a useful thing to do, but, you know.
Right. right. Yeah, I think I'm going to close it here. And once again, thank you so much. We really appreciate the time.
Let me say from my side, thank you very much, and sorry it's taken so long to get here. But it's always been on my radar to come and have this conversation because I knew it would be an interesting conversation, a stimulating conversation, and of course I've had, linkages too few, not often enough, with colleagues from UNISA, so the department is close to my heart, and I think you do wonderful work here. I know about the work that you do here, so it's been a privilege and an honour to be here, so thank you very much.
Thank you.